A thinking generation. This afternoon we're going to look at the importance of thinking, but not thinking as we often imagine it as, of PhDs in philosophy and stuff like that. But no, thinking from cause to effect, independent thinking, the kind of thinking that God calls us to. Because I believe this is a major problem in society today. The research has shown it very well. Let me start with a story. I was in a classroom many years, it's been about 5 years ago, I guess, 6 years ago, and doing some assistant work. So a fifth grader came up and needed some help with her math. So I asked her, I said, okay, what don't you understand? She came to a problem she didn't know the answer to. I said, sure, I can help you with that. What about it don't you understand? I don't know, she says. Okay. I said, well, what's your goal? What are you trying to accomplish here? I don't know. Okay, I said, what's the problem asking you for? The answer. I knew that, I eventually got her to put the answer down on paper. But that was only after this long drawn-out process of how I walked her through this step by step, eventually, number by number. Oh, yeah, that's the answer, and she moved on. I know if she would meet this problem in with different numbers, she wouldn't be able to solve it. Why? Because she didn't understand the concept behind what she was supposed to learn. She only learned the specific details and numbers about this problem. She didn't understand the concept behind it. And that's just a very simple example of countless experiences I've had in the classroom working with students, and I really found that they couldn't think. There was something going on that was just preventing them from really solving things and really figuring things out. I heard a lot of teachers complaining about it. They would say, my kids can't think. And I would tell the teachers, you just need to motivate them better. That's your only problem. And as I started seeing it for myself, though, it wasn't that they didn't want to, but that they simply couldn't think. There was something wrong. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I realized there was something wrong with the environment that was creating kids who simply couldn't think. There was something that was the problem. In fact, a recent study told us this very thing, and as it found that more than 80% of employers said recent graduates were deficient in applied skills like communication, work ethic, and critical thinking. 80% deficient in critical thinking skills. Now, psychologists tell us that less than half of us are even capable of thinking properly. That's scary enough as it is, less than half of us. But what the shocking point is, they tell us that only 5% of us ever use it. So how many of you are thinkers? That's too many. 5%, that's all. I hope there's more than 5% here. But that's what they are showing. And that, to me, is a major problem. We can't have a non-thinking society. And I believe more than an academic problem or a practical problem, this is a problem from a spiritual perspective. Because Satan wants a society, a generation that doesn't think. God wants thinkers, independent thinkers. In the book Gospel Workers, it reads, moral purity depends on right thinking. Now, do we want our young people to grow up morally pure? Yes or no? Absolutely we do. And it depends on what? It depends on right thinking. Young men must be trained up to be thinkers. God calls upon everyone with whom he works to do the very highest kind of thinking. So moral purity depends on it. It should be part of the educational process. And God calls upon every one of us. If we want to take part in the work he has given us, we need to be thinkers. It's sounding pretty important, is it not? I mean, this isn't just a matter of not being able to figure out your math in school. No, this is a major, an important aspect of life that God has called us to. God has given men talents, which he means they should use. He has given them minds, and he means they should become thinkers and do, notice, it says, their own thinking and planning, rather than depending upon someone else to think and plan for them. And that, to me, is really where the heart of this matter is. It's all about whether or not you are thinking for yourself or you're depending upon someone else to think for you. Every human being created in the image of God, that's all of us here, I hope we're all human beings, is endowed with a power akin to that of the Creator. Now this word akin, we don't use this too often. What is this word akin referring to in this sentence? What is it? A likeness, yeah, like. So every one of us, we've been created in the image of God, and we've been given a power like that of our Creator. So what is this power, we ask? individuality, power to think and to do. That's a power that God himself has, and it's a power that he has placed in each one of us. That power of individual thought, and that's why I said earlier, this is not about how many PhDs you have, nothing against the PhDs, but that's not the type of thinking we're discussing here. Neither is it a discussion of philosophies and ideas of the world. No, this is that ability to stand for your beliefs though the heavens fall. This is that ability to understand your beliefs and not just base it on somebody else's opinion. The men in whom this power is developed are the men who bear responsibilities, who are leaders in enterprise, and who influence character. And we need a generation who are ready to bear responsibilities. We need a generation who can lead instead of being led, and we need a generation who can influence instead of being influenced. This paragraph in the book Education continues. It is the work of true education to develop this power, to train the youth to be thinkers and not mere reflectors of other men's thoughts. When I read that, I said that's exactly what the problem is. We have a system of education and of society in general that is culturing reflectors, teaching them to duplicate what somebody else said and put it out on a test later, teaching them to only study other men's works instead of the Word of God, the source of truth. Students should be directed to the sources of truth, and yet we're merely training reflectors. We need a generation that's strong to think and act, who are masters and not slaves of their circumstances, who have a breadth of mind, a clearness of thought, a courage of their convictions, because in times of discouragement and darkness, how important to have what kind of men? Thinking men, who are not dependent on circumstances, but who trust God and labor on in the darkness as well as the light. We will soon have times of discouragement and darkness. We know this is coming upon the world, and how important it is that we have thinking men. But thinking abilities, as I've already said, it goes far beyond the academic, it goes beyond the practical, it goes beyond our ability to work for God, it goes right to our heart, right to the heart of our personal spirituality, right to the heart of our spiritual success in the last days. Let's look at this from the Bible. Turn with me to Revelation. Revelation chapter 7. I want to illustrate to us, just 2 verses here that illustrate it very well, how the end-time battle is a battle over who has control over your mind. Who has control over your mind in the end days? That is the question of the last days. Revelation chapter 7, verses 2 and 3. Revelation chapter 7, verses 2 and 3. I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, Hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of God. Okay, this is God's seal being placed upon his servants, till we have sealed the servants of God. Where? In their foreheads. What does the forehead represent? Our mind, our thinking. God wants to place his seal upon our thinking. Who has control over your thoughts? You realize this is not a rubber stamp placed upon the skin of your forehead, right? This is symbolic, representing that God has management over your mind. But is God the only one who wants control over our mind? Not at all. Turn over a few chapters. Revelation 14. Revelation 14, verse 9. 14, verse 9. The third angel, we're now speaking of the mark of the beast. The third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, If any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark, where does it say? In his forehead, or in his hand, it says. So God wants us to choose to follow him. Satan says, I'll go for the mind first. If I can't get that, I'll go for the actions. But where do they both go first? Right for the mind. The end-time battle is a battle over who has control over your mind. Romans. Turn over to Romans. Romans 12. 12, verse 2. Paul tells us, Romans 12, verse 2, Be not conformed to this world. There's that reflecting other men's thoughts that we just read about. So how do we not be reflecting other men's thoughts? It says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The end-time battle is over who has control of your mind, and Paul tells us in order to not be a reflector of other men's thoughts, you need your mind transformed. This is a theme we see all throughout the Bible. 1 Peter 1:13, Peter says, gird up the loins of your mind, strengthen them for the battle ahead of you. In Isaiah 1:18, God says, come, let us reason together. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. He links that reasoning process right with the process of salvation. This is a critical issue in the last days. Who has control over your mind? Satan's the father of lies, and he will bring about deceptions in the last days to the point of nearly deceiving God's people. How will they resist his temptations? By having control of their minds, using their minds through the power of their Holy Spirit to resist the temptations of Satan. The warfare in which we are engaged is largely mental. We're not fighting Satan with swords and guns, right? This is a mental battle we are engaged in. The mind that is the most thoroughly trained will do the most acceptable work. God knows that our young people, this is the book Messages to Young People, will have to battle against the powers of darkness that strive to gain control of the whole mind. Satan takes control over every mind that is not decidedly under the control of the Spirit of God. So, we've identified that this is an important spiritual issue. So we should ask ourselves, if Satan is all about gaining control over the mind, how does he go about doing this? Does he wait until a child turns 18 and then says, all right, now's the day I'm going to start working on their minds? No, of course not. He starts very, very young. And there are many, many ways in which he does it. I read, we missed a couple quotes. I have to get these, sorry. Carter G. Woodson said, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. How true that is. Do you think Satan knows that? Absolutely. He says, I'll get control of the thinking, and then I don't have to worry about what they're doing. It was Adolf Hitler who said, how fortunate for leaders that men do not think. Think about that in terms of the last days. Do we want to be thinkers? Or do we want to be a society that's fortunate for the leaders? We want to be thinkers. Okay, so back to, as I was saying, how is Satan going to damage the thinking abilities of our children? I read recently in the book Counsels to Parents, Teachers, and Students that close reasoners and logical thinkers are few. We've identified that, right? Less than half of the population ever think. Why? False influences have checked the development of the intellect. What does this word checked mean? In this context, we don't use it like this very often. What is this word checked? Stopped, exactly. My grandpa's a dog trainer, and he uses a little rope that he calls a check lead. And so as he's training the dog, he hooks it on the collar. If the dog gets out of control, he checks it. He stops it. He holds it back with his check lead. This is exactly what this is saying. You know, psychologists tell us that children are born with this innate desire to learn. They want to figure out the world around them. They want to see what's going on and explore and discover. But then, so what we have is those thinking abilities progressing, but then something comes in and checks them, holds them back. False influences, it calls them. What sort of false influences could be checking the development of the intellect? And that's precisely what I want to get into now. False influences. I've called them tactics. Tactics of Satan. And we have 10 of them that we'll be talking about for the remainder of this afternoon. 10 tactics of Satan for damaging good thinking abilities. What is he doing? From the research, what's going on? First of all, a lack of physical activity. You're saying, hang on a second, this is a major shift. We're just talking about thinking skills, and now we're talking about physical activity. How are those connected? They are very connected. Research is now telling us that physical activity is actually more important than time spent studying. I didn't say just as important, actually more important. They say, look, if you have a limited amount of time, say you have an hour, and you can either go outside or do homework, you're better off going outside. The child will learn better spending more time outside than sitting down with the homework. Physical activity is critical for an area of the brain known as the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a very large, important area right behind the brainstem, so right down here in the green. And it deals with many important functions. It's linked with the higher frontal levels in the brain. Those frontal levels are those thinking abilities. A well-functioning cerebellum can help you be able to think better. That in and of itself should tell us this is a pretty important brain area. But there's more. It's also linked to the ability to perform repetitive activities automatically, like handwriting, music skills also. Many cognitive skills, those are learning skills. They recognize now that the cerebellum is critical for learning. Language skills, social interaction, music, and attention. Who here has used their cerebellum today? That should be all of us. It's a critical area of the brain. You don't want to do without your cerebellum. And they find that movement is absolutely necessary. Not just important, but critical. If the cerebellum is to develop properly, it needs a wide range of full body movement. They find for the infant that rocking helps develop the cerebellum. As they grow up a bit, crawling. Crawling helps develop the cerebellum. It helps develop the corpus callosum, which is a connection between the hemispheres of the brain that leads to whole brain thinking. Crawling is beneficial for many, many things. They find that toddlers who crawled a lot often have better reading skills later in life, and they've recently discovered that they also find they have better handwriting skills, not because of its effect on the brain, but because of its effect on the wrist muscles of being down like this crawling. So the more they study it, crawling is very, very beneficial. Also, spinning and hanging upside down. You wonder why kids love those things? You know, adults can't stand it. It's good for their brains, and they find that the vestibular system, the inner ear, is not stimulated in the same way as children. They don't have that same experience of dizziness that the adult has. So it's very important for them. Dr. Jane Healy is one of the eminent educational psychologists of our day. She has a lot of powerful information in science. You'll see a few quotes from her today. And she tells us that after birth, physical activities are one of the child's main means of advancing physical, intellectual, and emotional growth. So you should encourage many forms of body movement. So, okay, physical growth, intellectual growth, emotional growth, three very important areas of growth. How are they developing these? Through physical activity, not through sitting there with a textbook learning about how to have physical and emotional growth. No, the physical activity helps the areas of the brain, particularly the cerebellum, and that helps those other abilities. Now, there is one area of physical activity that is greater than all the rest, better than all the rest. Okay, so you have your indoor activities. Those are helpful, gym or whatnot. But those aren't as good as outdoor activity. Outdoor is always best, especially for children. But then amongst the outdoor activities you could do, there's one that's better than all the rest. Does anyone want to guess? Walking. Walking is the best form of exercise, yes. But as far as an outdoor activity, which one do you think would be even better than just taking a walk? Breathing. Breathing is good. We all have to breathe. What else?
Climbing trees.
Climbing trees? Hey, I like that. Any other guesses? All right, I'll give it away. Agriculture. No line of manual training is of more value than agriculture. Literally every time they research this subject, they find new reasons why kids should be in the garden. This is powerful. Let's take just a quick detour into this topic of agriculture. Students who are involved in gardening have been found to be more self-confident, have better self-esteem, were more patient, more persevering, had improved science understanding, better test scores, and were overall better learners. Gardening is very powerful for the mind. The experimental group of gardening students outperformed the control group of non-gardening students in all areas: general information, reading recognition, reading comprehension, total reading, mathematics, spelling, and written language. What do any of these things have to do with gardening? Nothing at all. But somehow the gardening process was helping them in these other areas. Substantial data suggests that outdoor activities have positive effects on self-esteem and mental health. And you know, we could go into, well, how does it teach them to become more patient? Well, you can't push a button and get vegetables, right? You actually have to put some effort into it and wait for it to develop. And there are many other, you know, that whole list I gave, it's pretty easy to understand how each of these things could be improved. But how does it improve the test scores and make children better learners? They're not quite sure, but they think they found some small clues. This is a bacterium known as Mycobacterium vaccae. Now, this bacterium has been found to reduce depression, improve lung health, boost the immune system, fight cancer, strengthen the digestive system, treat arthritis, improve emotional and mental health, lower stress and anxiety, reduce allergies, and to top it off, make you smarter. Who wants to pick up some Mycobacterium vaccae at the health food store? Unfortunately, you can't. Where do you get Mycobacterium vaccae? From the dirt. It's actually in the soil in which your gardens grow. So they find that sticking your hands in the dirt, you can absorb it underneath your fingernails. Going barefoot in the garden is very good for you. And the skin of the vegetables that you grow can absorb some of this mycobacterium. So if they're not really dirty, don't scrub them too hard. Ingesting a little bit of dirt is actually okay for you. Compared to the mice that did not ingest the bacterium, the M. vaccae mice navigated a maze twice as fast and exhibited half of the anxiety behaviors. So not only were they smarter, but they were less stressed throughout this process. So evidently getting dirty actually makes you smarter. So next time your kid comes in covered with dirt and mud, just think about how much smarter they're getting and not about the laundry you have to do. And in addition to making us smarter, they found that these bacteria can make us healthier. They found that exposure to these naturally occurring dirt and dust found outside can actually increase your resistance to allergies and to asthma. They find that children who live on farms typically have less than half the incidence of allergies and asthma compared to those who lived in urban areas. Half the incidence, which is ironic because we usually associate allergies and asthma with what? Well, with outside, right? The stuff, the dirt and the dust you find outside. But they literally find that as the child is exposed to those things at an early age, the body builds up an immunity to it, and so they won't have those problems later on. The M. vaccae had the exact same effect as antidepressant drugs. These data support the idea that the greater diversity of microbial exposure among children who live on farms is associated with protection from the development of asthma. These studies help us understand how the body communicates with the brain and why a healthy immune system is important for maintaining mental health. They also leave us wondering if we shouldn't all be spending more time playing in the dirt. From a scientist, he says, go play in the dirt. I mean, how much easier can it get? A very simple remedy, a very simple help. The Garden of Eden was not only Adam's dwelling, but his schoolroom. This was an environment in which he was to learn of God, and as we've seen, many other things. You can teach your child so many great things through agriculture. Okay, point number 2, overstimulation. Overstimulation. Overstimulation can take many forms. So first of all, we have the overloading of children with too many electronics. I'll get into more of that in a few minutes here. But we also have too many toys. Kids have so much to do these days, so much to grab their attention, that we're now actually seeing attention deficit disorders on the rise because they always have something to turn to, always something to do, and so they don't develop the ability to pay attention to something. They actually find that children, the more toys they have, the more bored they are. Process that one a bit. Less toys equals less bored because they have to focus on something for a longer period of time. There's not always something to jump to and catch their attention. Also, just the piling on of so many activities in the day-to-day life can be harmful and can encourage superficial thinking. They found that overstimulation can cause stress in the mind, create a danger response in the mind. Literally, as the brain becomes overwhelmed with too many activities, it starts feeling that, whoa, this is scary. It creates overactivity, frustration, irritability, superficial thinking. And within the educational environment, we see this as a problem too, because we're just quickly rushing kids from one thing to another. You know, it's math class, now stop math and you have to go do science. Now stop that and you have to go do, now stop that and does this sound familiar, right? I mean, that's how it's done. Elizabeth Walling put it well. The bell will ring just when they're engulfed in learning about the solar system to tell them it's time to start learning how to dissect a sentence. A child learns that no subject is truly meaningful or interesting, and therefore learns not to be truly interested in anything meaningful. Sound familiar? Yeah, this is just how it operates. It's not encouraging good thinking abilities. Children really need that time to think and to explore. And the beauty of the exploration process is they can learn some what are called incidental learning opportunities, things that come up in the everyday life that can teach them a lot more than if you just sat them down with a textbook. Take this example. Another youngster was busy constructing some mental schemas about number. He lined up 8 blocks in a row and counted them in one direction, then backward to see if they were the same. Then he stacked them up into a tower and counted them again, up and down. Convinced that 8 is 8 from all directions, he skipped off, unaware that he had just mastered an abstract mathematical idea. I mean, here was practical everyday learning. This is how kids learn best. And yet we take them out of the real life situation, we sit them down with a textbook, and it's not connecting in their minds the same way, and it's not building through all areas of the brain, and therefore we're decreasing those critical thinking abilities. Dr. Raymond Moore, another eminent researcher, he's since passed away, but he puts it well as he says, quietness, calmness, and freedom from artificial excitement build strength in the immature child. That's exactly what we read in the book Child Guidance. The more quiet and simple the life of the child, the more free from what kind of excitement? Artificial excitement. And the more in harmony with what? Nature, the more favorable it is to physical and mental vigor and spiritual strength. Those are the three areas of education: physical education, mental education, and moral education. And it's favorable to all three. Point number 3, too much study. The young people love it when I talk about this one. Study is good, but can we have too much of a good thing? Absolutely, and we're seeing this as a major problem today. Too much study has been linked to learned helplessness, where the mind becomes so overwhelmed with this learning process that now it believes that it can't learn. And shutting off superficial learning, burnout, illnesses, and many learning disabilities are now linked to simply too much time in the classroom. A lot of learning specialists are saying, look, if we just give our kids some time, send them outside for a bit, we wouldn't be seeing many of the learning disabilities we're seeing now. Point number 4, testing. Any teachers here? All right, great. So you'd probably agree with me that standardized testing has its problems, yeah? Everybody talks about standardized testing and points the fingers at it. I'd like to take this a little closer, though, and just consider the idea of testing in general. Who says that we need to quantify and qualify and measure and standardize and then put a label on kids? You know, is that really helpful for learning? I would argue not quite. Dr. David Elkin comes to us with a PhD in child development from Tufts University. He wrote a great book called The Hurried Child, and he's arguing that kids aren't even getting an experience in being a kid, being a child anymore. He tells us that schools have become increasingly industrialized and product-oriented. Teachers are unionized, textbooks are standardized on a national level, and testing has become mechanized, machine-scored, and all-pervasive as a consequence. Education is reforming, which means more basics, more hours, more homework, more testing, more of everything that is creating the problem. It's a classic case of the cure being worse than the disease. I like the way you put that. The factory model of education hurries children because it ignores the individual differences in mental abilities and learning rates and learning styles. Children are pressured to meet uniform standards as measured by standardized tests. Those who cannot keep up in this system, as indicated by the test, are often regarded as defective vessels and labeled learning disabled or ADHD. That's a sad system. We don't want to be putting our kids through that environment. Now, here's the point to take away, though. Under these circumstances, children discover very quickly that passing tests rather than meaningful learning was what school is all about. Surely you can relate to this. I think about my college years. You know, you cram the night before, you take the test in the morning, and an hour later you don't remember anything you wrote down on that test. You know, it's not encouraging good thinking abilities. School became an environment of passing tests, not meaningful learning. And that's exactly what Carla Hannaford, a biologist in her book Smart Moves, puts. There is no time or space to develop deep understanding of concepts, to test out new ideas through verbal and written action, or develop deductive reasoning skills. The memorizing necessary for these tests is a linear process that does not require entire brain use. Rote memory is a straight line process requiring none of the depth of understanding that comes from whole brain activation. In short, rote memory does not require thinking. Okay, if we're wanting to encourage thinking skills, this is not doing it. Now, I would clarify there is a difference between rote memorization and memorizing something with understanding and meaning. A lot of us have had an experience in life where we've learned something through that experience, and likely you remember it now. Did you sit there and have to learn how to memorize it? No, you experienced it and you learned it, you memorized it because you learned it well. Same for scripture memorization. There should be memorization with meaning behind it, not rote memory where you're just learning a fact long enough to put it down on a test. Now, another major problem with the testing environment is that we are treating all kids the same. A cookie-cutter system, one size fits all. Education cannot be one size fits all. It doesn't even make common sense. And there's a great parable that illustrates this well, called the animal story. Absorb this graphic for just a moment. For a fair selection, everybody has to take this same exam. Please climb that tree. Now, out of these animals, I can only see one that's going to be happy about this, right? This monkey right here is the only one that's even going to pass this test. There's a story, a parable. You see, once upon a time, the animals decided they needed to do something to meet the problems of a new world. So they organized a school. They adopted an activity curriculum that consisted of running, climbing, swimming, and flying. 4 subjects. Now, to make it easier to administer the curriculum, all the animals took all the subjects. They were all highly motivated. They wanted to get good grades, so they each tried very hard. Well, for starters, we had the duck. The duck was excellent in swimming and in flying. In fact, better than his instructor, but he lagged behind his classmates in running and in climbing, so he had to stay after school, and drop swimming and flying in order to practice the 2 subjects that he wasn't as good at. Soon his webbed feet were badly worn from running that he was only average in swimming. But average was acceptable in school, so nobody worried about that except the duck. At the start of the year, the squirrel. Now, I've learned you don't have these in Australia, but here's a picture for you. Furry little creatures, highly energetic, climb trees, chew on things. They're generally a pest in the US. At the start of the year, the squirrel was first in his class in climbing and in running, and second only to the duck at flying. But the difference was, in his flying class, he developed some pretty serious frustration issues because his teacher made him start from the ground up instead of the treetop down. He developed Charlie horses from overexertion and caught pneumonia in swimming class, so he missed so much school that he got a C in climbing and a D in running. To make matters even worse, because the squirrel constantly squirmed and chattered in class and had difficulty paying attention, he was diagnosed with a learning disorder. The squirrel eventually was placed in remedial classes and had to be medicated in order to continue his schoolwork. The rabbit started at the top of his class in running, but had a nervous breakdown because of so much makeup work in swimming. The fox was a natural in his running class and scored well in climbing and in swimming, but became so frustrated at his inability to get good grades in flying that he began assaulting his classmates. He even tried to eat the duck. His behavior was so disruptive, he was expelled from school, he fell in with a rough crowd, and eventually wound up in a center for animal delinquents. The eagle was a problem child and was disciplined severely. In the climbing class, he beat all the others to the top of the tree, but he insisted on using his own weight to get there. The elephant, meanwhile, developed low self-esteem because he couldn't do well in any of the subjects. When he sank into clinical depression, his therapist persuaded him to try a different school that focused on subjects such as lifting and carrying. The elephant was disappointed because careers in lifting and carrying were not as prestigious as careers in running, climbing, flying, or swimming. Even though he always felt inferior, he managed to make a decent living and support his family. At the end of the year, an abnormal eel that could swim exceedingly well and also run, climb, and fly a little had the highest average and was valedictorian. The prairie dogs, another U.S. animal, they live underground, they dig burrows underground. They stayed out of school and fought the tax levy because the administration would not add digging and burrowing to the curriculum. They apprenticed their children to a badger and later joined the groundhogs and gophers to start a successful private school. It's a funny parable, and obviously no such thing ever happened. But can you see the serious side of this? Can you see the parallels? Can you see how crazy it is to think that we can have a one-size-fits-all education? It doesn't make even common sense. Let's value the diversity that God has placed in every child. By the way, this story came out of a talk that I have that I'm not getting to today, but it's called School or Educated, Disc 3 on this DVD series, all about educational principles. Okay, moving on to point number 5, poor health and nutrition. Poor health and nutrition. What we eat has a very incredible impact upon our minds, and we could spend a lot of time on this. I'm just going to mention a couple of quick points. Starting in infancy, they find that myelin, which is an essential component of brain development, is made up of essential fatty acids, particularly those found in breast milk. Breast milk is absolutely the best food for babies. No dispute on that one. They've also done studies, in childhood, I'll take one, for example, a study of 1 million students in New York. That's a huge study. You don't find studies that big very often. It caught my eye. And they took a group of students and took out artificial flavors, preservatives, and dyes. Didn't change the diet a whole lot. They just made sure they didn't have any food with those additives in it. And those students did 14% better on IQ tests. That's a huge jump. That's a major leap in IQ abilities. So what we eat has a powerful impact upon our minds. We also know that sugar has a very harmful effect on the developing mind, can interfere with myelination and a lot of other problems. We need good food for good thought. Point number 6, age segregation. Age segregation. This whole idea that we have to put kids with kids their same age in all these separated classes is a relatively new idea. What we now take for granted is not the way it was 100 years ago. Dr. Jay Fieldman and Peter Gray, some of the eminent researchers on age segregation today, explains the history of it a bit. As he says that the placement of children in separate classes with others of the same age is a fairly recent phenomenon. Age segregation did not occur in full force until the 1930s, when the advent of compulsory education laws brought a large influx of children to the public school system. That 1930s date would be the US. I don't know exactly what it is here, probably around the same time, but his point is that the compulsory education laws brought it in, not so much the date that's important, but the principle here. You had all these children coming to the school system, and so you had to organize them somehow. Until then, the main source of formal education for most children was the one-room schoolhouse, which on average contained approximately 25 children ranging in age from 5 to 15. Anyone gone to a schoolhouse like that? We have a few of the older generation here. All right, great. Wow. Not trying to say you're the older generation, but that's great. Still, it's quite unusual to find now. And the problem is that we're separating children from real life. Never in history until the 20th century have young people been largely separated from the ongoing and productive activities of society. Yet, society's survival depends on raising new generations in close proximity with adults who are engaged in their central roles. Institutional age segregation creates a situation in which parents' productive work, indeed major portions of their adult lives, are carried out in settings where there are no children. Children do not get to know a variety of adults and observe their lives. We need to ask ourselves a very important question, though. We're wanting to prepare children for the real world, right? That's our goal. That's our goal in education and parenting. So is the real world age segregated? No, not at all. Far from it. Dan Greenberg founded the Sudbury Valley School, which is an age-integrated school, and he puts it very well, sort of tongue-in-cheek, as he says, does such division take place naturally anywhere? In industry, do all 21-year-old laborers work separately from 20-year-olds or 23-year-olds? In business, are there separate rooms for 30-year-old executives and 31-year-old executives? Of course not, right? Where on earth was this idea conceived? Is anything more socially damaging than segregating children by year for 14 or often 18 years? Notice he says socially damaging. Isn't that interesting? Because we typically think that children need to be with kids their same age for proper socialization. That's the argument used. I'll get to more of that in just a moment. I just wanted to draw your attention to that. The Russian developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, he developed something known as the zone of proximal development. This is defined as tasks that a child can accomplish only with some assistance and support. Therefore, most learning, most cognitive development takes place in this zone, and children develop primarily by attempting tasks they can accomplish only in collaboration with a more competent individual. Okay, that's a complicated bunch of words. Let's see a simple example illustrates this very well. Anyone here ever seen a couple of 2 or 3-year-olds playing a game of catch with a ball? You're smiling, right? It's not very possible, right? Neither of them are coordinated well enough, and the game is just going to quickly dissolve. Suppose, though, we have a 2 or 3-year-old and a 9 or 10-year-old. Does the game become possible? Absolutely, because the 10-year-old can throw that ball into the outstretched arms of the 3-year-old, and then when the 3-year-old throws some crazy throw off into left field, the 10-year-old runs over there and catches it. So that the game of catch became within the zone of proximal development because it was a task, in this case a game of ball, that a child could accomplish only with some assistance and support. In this case, it was with the assistance of the 10-year-old. And that's why the learning takes place. That's why children develop primarily within this zone as they're interacting with those who are more competent than they. Now, it's been argued, though, well, isn't that what the classroom is? You have a more competent individual working with the younger ones. And not quite the same, because this was an interactive engagement. The child there was some interplay there, but if they're just sitting there absorbing, that's not the same environment. That's not the zone of proximal development. Now, research has found advantages in age-integrated classrooms in the areas of academics. They find children do better academically in age-integrated classrooms. They have better self-esteem. You know, you don't always have peers knocking each other down. You have a wider range of maturity, and they can help each other. And get this one, socialization skills. They actually find better socialization in age-integrated classrooms. They find that in age-segregated classrooms, they often have the opposite effect as intended. It actually is desocializing children many times because it's not teaching them preparation for real life. I was talking with a friend recently, and I had told him, you know, we really need to be looking and asking ourselves the question, are we trying to prepare children to be children or to be adults? Right? I mean, we need to ask her, okay, so of course we're going to be training them to be adults. We want to teach them how to be a meaningful adult in society. And so my friend, who's an educator himself, said, look, children don't learn how to be adults from other children. They learn from adults. I mean, that's the primary source of instruction on how to be an adult is going to come from other adults. So while there's nothing wrong with kids playing together, socializing together, if we're looking at the basic principle of good socialization, they're going to develop better socialization skills with a full age integrated environment, interacting with the adults who are wiser and more mature than they are. According to Dr. Larry Shires, the results seem to show that a child's social development depends more on adult contact and less on contact with other children as previously thought. We used to think it depended on adult contact. We now realize that on child contact, we now realize that it is dependent more on adult contact. And of course, it increases the learning capabilities. When you're little and just with kids your own age, the range of possible activities is restricted by the knowledge and abilities of those in your age group. But in collaboration with older kids, there's almost no limit to what you might do. You know, it allows them the freedom to learn and explore at their own pace. Besides, a close study of what big people were up to was always the most exciting occupation of youth. Was it not? Isn't that the way it used to be? You couldn't wait to go see what Grandpa was up to on the farm or what Dad was up to in the workshop or whatever it was. That was the most exciting thing you could do, and we've sort of lost that in this day and age where everybody's sort of in their own little world. Children are compared to everyone else of the same age, and they're not encouraged to rise to that higher thinking level because they're spending the majority of their lives with those who are more or less at the same level that they are, using a generalization there. The book Education reads that cooperation should be the spirit of the schoolroom, the law of its life. Let the older assist the younger. That's how it should be. And the strong the weak, and so far as possible, let each be called upon to do something in which he excels. This will encourage self-respect and a desire to be useful. There's a great documentary on age segregation. We don't have audio here, so I'm going to skip showing you the clip, but I'll show you the DVD. It's called Divided. You can, I have copies with me, and for the viewers, you can also access that on my website at thinkinggeneration.org. Great documentary on how age segregation has failed the church, how our youth are leaving in droves, and it's because we have separated them from the family. And it's challenging parents to take up their work again, to be more involved in their young people's lives and not leave it up to the church to do the job for them. Highly recommend this documentary. Point number 7, television and electronics. This is the big one. Every time I mention thinking abilities, they say, somebody will tell me, oh, it's the TV, that's what's doing it. It is a major factor. There are a lot of rabbit trails we could go off on here. I just want to focus on a couple of major points. A lot of attention has been given to the dangers of bad content in media. I think most Christian parents intuitively know, though, they're not going to put their child in front of bad content. We realize that somewhat intuitively. But I will just mention this, that as we're going to see through a couple of these quotes, it forces the mind into a very passive state. They say within a few seconds, I believe it's 20 seconds of watching television, the frontal lobe completely shuts off. The frontal lobe is that decision-making area of your brain. So it reaches the state where whatever you're viewing enters your brain as complete truth. You just accept it as it's dished out to you. So think about that as you decide what to watch and what to be involved in media. It must be absolutely true, because your mind is going to receive it as truth, whether it is truth or not. So it's critical that we watch, that we are concerned about the content. But content aside, I just want to look at the impact of media itself. Even good content media. Is it helpful? A major problem with media in early childhood is that it is separating them from real life. Sitting there with the screen is not real life. It's not living. It's not the real interactive engagement with the real world, and it's starving them of essential brain development time. Again, Dr. Jane Healy, in her book Endangered Minds, much early development of physical and mental skills and their foundations in the brain comes from experimenting and solving problems with what kind of materials? Real-world materials, not the screen. The long-term outcomes of forcing children's attention unnaturally may have even more serious implications than we have realized. Notice she says it's forcing their attention unnaturally. Keep that concept in your mind. We'll get to that in a moment. She has a list of 8 problems with media. First of all, it overstimulates children. We've already seen that that's a problem. We don't want the mind to be overstimulated. That in and of itself is a problem, but it also creates what's known as passive withdrawal. The thinking centers of the brain begin to shut down. The brain sits there very passive, not actively engaged in the learning. It causes attention and listening problems. We've seen the rise of ADHD and many attention deficit disorders right along with the use of electronics. It emphasizes skills which do not transfer well to reading or listening and requires less mental effort than reading. For wanting to encourage good reading skills, television viewing is not helping that at all, because it's so easy compared to sitting there and studying and reading. If we want to encourage them to study, to love to study God's Word, if we're feeding them a diet of ease and just absorbing, we're not going to encourage in them that love for the study of God's Word. It also shortens the time that children are willing to spend on finding an answer to intellectual problems they are set to solve. It's decreasing problem solving and persevering mentalities. It artificially manipulates the brain into paying attention by, again, there's that forcing the attention, by violating certain of its natural defenses with frequent visual and auditory changes. Let's unpack this a bit. This is known as saliency. Sudden close-ups, pans, zooms are effective in alerting the brain because they violate its reflex need to maintain a predictable personal space. Salient features such as bright colors, quick movements, or sudden noises get attention fast, since brains are programmed to be extremely sensitive to such changes that might signal danger. Look, unless you're sitting there watching a seminar, a video of me presenting, something simple and boring like that, then this is television. I mean, this is, sudden close-ups, pans, zooms, bright colors, quick movements, sudden noises. That's television as we know it. You can't even watch a good documentary without being exposed to this sort of environment. So what is it doing? Well, first of all, it's getting your attention. We're hardwired that way. We are wired to catch anything that moves will take priority over anything else. I was hearing from Dr. David Walsh, as he brings out in the documentary Captivated, and he's saying how if you're sitting there reading a book, or say you're sitting here right now listening to me, and a mouse ran across that wall over there, where would your head turn? You'd want to see what that mouse was. I mean, because it's movement. We're wired that way to see what's going on. That's just how we're programmed. That's how God has designed us. So what's happening is it's catching our brain's attention. But what happens is that these carefully planned manipulations separate the natural responses of brain and body. So our attention is alerted, but there's no need for physical action. For example, the brain registers specific changes after a camera zoom, for example, responding as if to real danger, yet the impulse has no outlet. It's like this. Suppose you're on a safari. You've gone to Africa, and you're going on a safari, so you jump in the vehicle, and off you go into the African savannah. And then the vehicle slows down, and you're tired of riding, so you decide to get out and walk. And so you get out and you're moving along and you're enjoying the scenery, looking around, watching the animals and such. And then you hear a noise and you look, and in the bush over there is a lion. And you're like, oh, that's cool, a lion. And then he crouches and his tail twitches and he roars. Now what are you going to do? Run. How fast? Hopefully faster than the lion, right? Back to that vehicle. You're going to do something quick. And that's that natural response of brain and body. Your brain says, whoa, that's scary. Get me out of here. And it kicks in the adrenaline and everything that you can imagine pumping through your body. All that goes in, that helps you get out of that situation faster. The problem is you're sitting there. Your brain registers something as dangerous on the television. You might not think it's dangerous, but your brain says it is. And yet you sit there doing nothing. And so all those same chemicals, all the same hormones, everything gets dumped into your body, but you're sitting there and that natural response of brain and body has been disconnected. Of course, common sense would tell us too much of that's going to be harmful to adults. But it's particularly harmful to the young mind because it's trying to figure out the world. It's trying to understand how life and society and the environment around it are working. And so we're confusing the mind as the little baby is sitting there getting this input, but there's no physical action. And you can see this even in toddlers using, it's not just television. Take a little baby, give them an iPad, and watch them play around on it. And if they open an app and the screen changes, you'll see the flinch response in their eyes. Just a little bit of a startle. Even if they've experienced it before, you can still see a little bit in their eyes. And that's the brain saying, hey, this is scary, and yet they're just not doing anything about it. So it's very confusing to the mind. Definitely something to be concerned about. 2 more points on the results of television and electronics. Point number 7, it induces neural passivity. Now what's neural referring to? Brain, yeah, brain cells. What's passivity? No action, yeah, doing nothing. So your brain cells are doing nothing. Literally, it's inducing your brain to sit there and just chill, not do anything. And it reduces the brain's ability to remain actively focused on a task. Research strongly suggests that fast-paced and special effects can interfere with the development of active learning habits. And lastly, this is the really big one, television has a hypnotic, possibly neurologically addictive. This book was written about 10 years ago. They now know there's no question about it being possibly neurologically addictive. It absolutely is neurologically addictive. Effect on the brain by changing the frequency of its electrical impulses in ways that block active mental processing. Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Television has a hypnotic. Now, we could apply the same to a lot of electronics too, but just imagine the environment of television. Hypnotic, what is the definition of hypnotic? Anyone? What's hypnotic mean? One mind controlling another one's mind. Yeah, I like that. Hypnotic is this state where you'll take in whatever you're given. So somebody else can control you because of that. They did a famous experiment, and they took a very strong person, I believe it was a bodybuilder or a weightlifter of some sort, and they sat him down on a chair and hypnotized him. They placed a glass of water in front of him and told him, as he was in this state of hypnosis, told him that he could not lift this glass of water. It was too heavy for him. They then restored him to normal functioning, out of hypnosis, perfectly normal. This guy was super strong. He could lift a lot of weight. And they said, sir, can you hand me that glass of water? He reaches over, takes hold of the glass of water, and can't pick it up. And so he starts straining at it. And his muscles are bulging. Sweat is pouring down his face as he's trying to pick up this glass of water. That is how powerful this environment. You get into this hypnotic state. And like I said earlier, it just dishes out to you and you receive it as truth. It affects us in ways that we don't yet understand. It's something to be very, very concerned about. And then neurologically addictive. What is addictive? I mean, what are definitions of addiction? Something you keep going back to. Yeah, you can't get enough of it, right? Yeah, you can't. You just want more and more and more and more. And that's exactly what they're finding with young people. And it's also something that you can't get away from. Not only do you want more of it, but you can't get away from it. Most young people, teenagers, you tell them you're going to take their electronics away or their video games, and they're just going to have a meltdown, you know, because they literally feel like they can't do without it. That should tell us how addicting it is. That should tell us that we definitely need to be concerned. And then lastly, how it points out that it blocks the active mental processing. It is shutting down the thinking abilities of the brain, a major cause for concern. It's not just television, though. The iPads and iPhones and smartphones and laptops and all the electronics in general are causing many of these same problems. The thing to remember is that research is slow in coming. Research is not as well funded as the electronics industry. So, you know, the latest and greatest comes out, and 4 years later the research comes out that says, oh, by the way, that's damaging, you know, take it easy on those things. And you're like, well, thanks a lot, you know, a little late on that. And that's the problem. So as the research comes out, we never find benefits. We're always finding more problems. So it would be a wise choice just to avoid as much as possible. The American Academy of Pediatrics many years ago used to recommend no screen time until the age of 2. And that's still their official recommendation. But other organizations have come out since then. A few years back, one said, based on the research, you'd probably better off keeping screens away from children until they reach the age of 7, based on the damage that we're seeing. And then another organization came out, well, no, really it should be 8, because we're just seeing a lot of problems. And based on the process of brain development, they really need that interactive environment, and the screens are going to be harmful until they reach the age of 8. The beginning of 2015, another organization came out and said, based on the research, based on the problems we're finding, we're recommending keeping screens limited as much as possible until they reach the age of 12. And it's going to be adulthood before too long, I think. You know, the principle is that the more they research, the more damaging it is. The current recommendation from the Academy of Pediatrics is that once they get to, you know, the teenage years, it should be no more than 2 hours per day spent in electronics. Anyone want to guess what the current average is for teenagers in electronics per day? Screen time per day, hours. How many do you think? 4? 8? 12. You hit it. It's 12 hours per day. That's for the US. I did a little research over here. I found a stat for the 20 years olds, and it was 10 hours and 21 minutes a day. The teenagers are going to be using more, so it's going to be very close to the US estimate of 12 hours per day. Far more than 2 hours, though. And what they find is that 9 hours out of that are spent in entertainment media. It's gone out of control, and we need to dial back. We need to be eliminating as much of that as possible. Media is damaging to the mind regardless of the content. That's the point to take away. It's not just about the content, it's about the environment itself. It's disconnecting them from real life. Now, I hear this from parents a lot. Mothers especially tell me, now hang on a second. This is the best babysitter I have. Like, nothing keeps my child's attention like the iPad. You're absolutely right. What did we just read? It's hypnotic. It's neurologically addictive. Earlier we saw, Dr. Healy said, it's forcing their attention. You're absolutely right. It is a babysitter. It holds their attention phenomenally well, but it's not a good babysitter. It's damaging. Send them outside. That was the babysitter that we had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and that has been historically the best babysitter out there. It still is. We don't need everything that we think we do. And for adults, let me just mention a couple other quick studies. They've done studies on people using e-book readers versus reading something out of an actual physical book. Those who read it out of the page had far greater reading comprehension and retention than those read it out of a book. Those read it off of a screen. What's that? Out of an e-book, exactly. They've also done studies on people taking notes. And those who take notes on paper remember far more than those who take notes on a laptop, especially, even though they can write down twice as much on a laptop that they could on a paper. The process of having to internalize it, decode it, shorthand it onto the paper helped them remember it better. So we could stand to go back to that simple, old-fashioned lifestyle. Can we call it old-fashioned? Amen. All right. We saw it earlier, quiet and simple. I mean, that's the principle. Let's go back to that quiet, simple lifestyle, free from artificial excitement, more in harmony with nature. Another documentary, I'm not going to show that right now, but that is Captivated. Powerful, powerful look at the impacts of media on children from some of the top scientists around the world, around the U.S. Actually, it was U.S. produced, and also its impact on the family, encouraging families to take a break from the media, separate themselves from this thing that is pulling families apart. And soon to come, currently taking pre-orders, is iChild, how electronics are programming our children's brains. Those are presentations that I'm working on, will soon to be released. We need as little as possible in these electronics. It seems so natural and normal as part of our everyday life, but we could stand to go back to old-fashioned. All right, a couple other quick points, and then we'll take a break. Point number 8 is an education chiefly of the mind. It's rather ironic that an education that's just focusing on cultivating the mental skills will soon cause the brain to lose whole brain thinking. It's like this. Imagine for a moment that you're in a problem-solving situation. Every area of your brain is needed for processing the different areas of this problem-solving situation. So you have the right hemisphere, hard at work coming up with creative solutions, imagining, processing the whole picture, providing intuition and insight. The left hemisphere, analyzing the situation, using details, logic, crunching the numbers, taking notes. The frontal lobe, it's helping you concentrate, controlling your mood, your behavior, aiding you in that final decision-making process. Broca's area is controlling speech. The occipital lobe is controlling visual perception. The temporal lobe is controlling hearing, language, memory. Every area of your brain has its specific function. So what happens is if we put kids through this environment of solely focusing on mental culture, mental as in, and when I say that, I'm talking like sit down in the classroom type of study, that is generally just strengthening the left hemisphere. Among other things, but it's focused on left hemisphere skills. And so what happens is the other areas of the brain are not getting worked. So suppose another analogy here. Suppose I wanted to work out a bit because I wanted bigger arm muscles. I felt like I needed to get a little stronger. So I head to the gym. Now the thing is this, as I think about all the effort it's going to take me to work out, I realize that I'm very right-hand dominant. I don't use my left arm very much. In fact, it's plenty strong enough as is. That one's going in my pocket, and I'm going to just work out with my right arm. So day after day, I'm at the gym lifting weights with my right arm. 2 months goes by. What's going to happen? Yeah, this one's going to atrophy, right? This one's bigger, this one's going to atrophy. So I'm lopsided, and the area that hasn't been worked begins to recede into the distance. And that's exactly what they find with the mind. If we're purely focusing on the mental skills, working that left hemisphere all the time, we're going to cause those other areas of the brain to recede into the background, and we're killing problem-solving and thinking abilities. We're told that education should be the harmonious development of the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. The physical, the mental, and the spiritual. And yet, too often, we're just focusing on mental. I mean, that's what schools do, right? Focus on the mental. No, we need some physical activity in there. Also, we've already talked about how important that is, and we need some spiritual, some moral development also. Oops. An education derived chiefly from books leads to superficial thinking. Nothing wrong with books, right? But if that's all we're focusing on, we're creating superficial thinking. Practical work encourages close observation and independent thought. Rightly performed, it tends to develop that practical wisdom, which we call common sense. We don't have enough common sense these days, right? It develops the ability to plan and execute, strengthens courage and perseverance, and calls for the exercise of tact and skill. Point number 9, a lack of training to think. Children need some encouragement. They need to be allowed to figure things out for themselves, to explore, to go back to how it used to be as a child, right? And yet we're so micromanaging, and we have these, safe playgrounds with these equipment and environments that you couldn't get hurt on if you tried to. They need a chance to make some minor mistakes, to get a little dirty, to scrape their knees up, and just experience real life, because it teaches them problem solving. They have to figure things out for themselves. They have to learn. We're going to encourage, as they learn that every action they make has a consequence, a physical, practical consequence to it, they'll begin to apply that in the spiritual area. We have seen a lack of physical activity, overstimulation, too much study, testing, poor health and nutrition, age segregation, television and electronics, and education chiefly of the mind, a lack of training to think, and now for tactic number 10, that is Satan's biggest tactic. It causes an inability to think formally, a disorganization of the brain, learned helplessness, learning disabilities, eye problems, school burnout, school dropout, a lack of spirituality, and a major cause of our young people leaving the church, a major cause of a lack of a thinking generation. What is it? Take a break and we'll find out. If you've enjoyed watching these programs and would like more information, please contact us through the information on your screen.